of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. Welcome on behalf of my boss, the Dean, Danny McIntosh, who sadly couldn't be here today, on behalf of the entire college, and on behalf of the offices of the Provost and the Chancellor of the University. This is one of the highlight events of the year for this university and this community. We're absolutely thrilled to be able to have this event with so many of you present, some very special guests, and a really distinguished speaker. This is one of many opportunities within the college for us to bring in scholars, experts, and just really cool, interesting people to come and talk about what they are experts in or really cool at doing. People come from all around the world to share their expertise with us, and we're thrilled to be able to do that. This afternoon, we're very pleased to present the 2018-19 Estlow Lecturer, who is Alexander Heffner. Mr. Heffner is the 26th Estlow Lecturer to be hosted by the university and is this year's Anvil of Freedom Award recipient. Before he speaks, I'm going to introduce you to Professor Lynn Schofield Clark, who is the chair of the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies. And speaking of experts who are also awesome, really interesting people doing cool things, she is definitely one of them. She is, in addition to being professor and chair, she's a director of the Estlow International Center for Journalism and New Media at the University of Denver. She has just begun her 13th year of service here, which I would be impressed by, except I'm in my 21st, so haha. But she's got a distinguished career here. She teaches courses in journalism and media studies, and is the author of the recently published book, Young People and the Future of News, which may be of interest to some people here, either because you're young or you're interested in the news, or both. And this book won the Best Book Award from the International Association of Internet Researchers, which is the largest interdisciplinary scholarly organization in the world focused on digital media. So a renowned scholar in her own right. She works with the Ed and Charlotte Estlow family and the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies to bring together this afternoon's event. And she will, in turn, be introducing Mr. Heffner. So thank you all for being here, and I will hand you over to the capable hands of Professor Clark.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Associate Dean Ingrid Tague, and thank you all for being here today. It's great to see you all. I wanted to acknowledge several people who I know are in the audience. So I know that we have, first of all, we have Professor Rachel Lieberman. She could wave back there. And if you are lucky enough to be in Professor Rachel Lieberman's class, could you clap right now? Let us know you're here. Woo, thank you. We also have Professor Amy Levesque here, who's kind of waving, right? So, and if you are from her class, which is Understanding Social Life Today, please give yourselves a round of applause. All right, thank you. We also have members of Ed Estlow's family here, Susan Lyday and Nancy Gwynn. If we could all welcome them by giving them a round of applause. And we have, and both Nancy and Susan are graduates of the University of Denver, and I see that there are a couple of other graduates of the University of Denver out in the audience as well. So if you're a graduate, could you raise your hand now? All right, thank you, and welcome back to campus. We also want to thank the Center for American Politics and the Rocky Mountain PBS, who are co-sponsors of this event with us and with the College for Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And I want to also give a special thanks to Amy Kintai, who is in the back and coordinated all the efforts for today. So please, let's give a round of applause for Emily. And Ethan Crawford, who is going to be live streaming the event and will also be making this available for us afterwards on Rocky Mountain PBS World Channel. So if we could thank Ethan for his work. Thanks. So now, how many here might be a journalism major? Do we have any journalism or media studies majors? If you could raise your hands. Okay, a couple of you. Good to see you all. How about some sociology majors? Political science, maybe? How about something in the sciences? A couple in the sciences. History majors? Any history majors? A few of you as well? All right. Well, I want to welcome all of you, and I missed a bunch of you. So how many of you are undeclared? Do we have any undeclared? So, all right. Well, welcome. We hope that this will help you to think about maybe going into something like journalism or politics. We never know. So, but thank you very much for coming here and being with us today. And before I introduce our speaker, I did want to tell you a little bit about how you all came to be here this afternoon. As Professor Tague mentioned, each year the Estlow International Center for Journalism and New Media works with industry professionals and academic leaders to select the Estlow lecturer and the recipient of the Anvil of Freedom Award. And the Estlow Center invites the honoree then to give a keynote lecture and then recognizes the lecturer's outstanding contributions to journalism and democracy. The lecturer is also invited to speak with classes and with student groups, and so our guest today will be with us tomorrow as well on campus. The Estlow Center is located in the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies, and our mission is to contribute to the public good by improving our collective understandings of how people make sense, make meaning out of journalism, digital media, and politics as they appear in journalism as well as in popular entertainment. And as Professor Tague mentioned, this is the 26th year of the Estlow Lectures. This year, we're pleased to recognize Alexander Heffner as Estlow Lecturer and recipient of the 2018-19 Anvil of Freedom Award. He'll be speaking with us today and then also with a different group of students tomorrow when he'll be offering the speech tomorrow called The Twitter Effect, Seeing Donald Trump's Tweets in Historical Perspective. So you may want to come back for that. Alexander Heffner is a journalist and civic educator who founded the first ever online national student newspaper covering the 2008 presidential election. How many in the room were involved in either student newspapers, yearbook, or broadcasting? Could you raise your hand if you were involved as a high school student or as a college student? A lot of you were. And actually the research shows that if you were involved in one of those student media organizations, you're more likely to do well in college than some of your other peers. So good for you, and glad that you're here at the University of Denver to bring all of that expertise and achievement orientation here. Alexander Heffner is also recognized for his role in hosting a 6-part series on college students and the vote that aired on the PBS channel WNET's Need to Know program. And Mr. Heffner's writings on millennials and elections have appeared in Time Magazine, USA Today, The Daily Beast, Reuters, RealClearPolitics, and the Wall Street Journal, among other venues. He was in Denver for the Democratic National Convention as well. Mr. Heffner is now host of PBS's The Open Mind, which is the longest airing TV program on PBS that was actually started by his grandfather. He's been hosting the program for the past 4.5 years, and because of his role with PBS, the Rocky Mountain PBS World Channel will be making this lecture available on their channel. Mr. Heffner has dedicated his career to supporting a civil, free press and a culture of bridge building, because he believes that is what is important and what a free press can help to support. He's second author with his grandfather of the book Documentary History of the United States, and he will be available after the talk to talk with you all one-on-one if you'd like, and he can sign copies of his book as well. His speech with us this afternoon is titled Civil Discourse in an Uncivil Age, The Quest for a Post-Partisan Citizenship. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Alexander Heffner.
Thank you all. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, family, and the entire university family. I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate your genuine interest in this subject matter. I started my career, as the Chair mentioned, much like you, in high school with a publication called Scoop 08. And the mission of Scoop 08 was inspired by my friend and my desire for there to be a space for young people to report and to comment on public policy during the 2008 presidential campaign. And so in late 2007, we launched a website that then went on to partner with a host of media outlets, including CNN, UPI, United Press International, that is, and young people's reporting from secondary schools, public schools, private schools, Arizona State, all across the country. And I reflect nostalgically on that because it was the emergence of what we come to understand today as new media, and it was, at least our website, was civil, was corroborated with facts, was a diverse cross-section of the American experience from young people's perspectives and their reporting, and was offering coverage of all the candidates from then Governor Huckabee and Congressman Paul to then Senators Biden and Senator Obama, Senator Clinton. But it demonstrated to me that in the infancy of what we consider the new media culture, there was a profound commitment, and it survived, at least during that campaign, to chronicling our experience as Americans without the divisive bitterness and acrimony and hate-mongering that so define our media and political culture today. And I want to frame the conversation with 3 quotes that I really govern my own interest in media. One was imparted to my grandfather and then imparted to me, which is something he heard from a Barnard College dean many decades ago. Keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. And that, to me, is the essence of the Open Mind right now, the program that I host on PBS stations. That is confronting the threats to democracy and being determined to honor our tradition of democratic values and norms. And if that makes you a partisan for democracy, or a partisan for free press, or a partisan for the First Amendment, then I endorse that mission. But we are committed to restoring civility, and that does not mean you're unable to engage vigorously in debates, contentious debates, but that fundamentally means, as I said to the New York Times when I started doing the show and succeeded my grandfather, interrogating ideas and not people. And that is a defining attribute of the program that I do. And if you watch The Open Mind on Sundays or Saturdays here or wherever may be home for you when you're not in school, you'll see opposite Face the Nation, Meet the Press, the Sunday political fare, not red meat, blue meat, if you will, raw meat to the partisans. You won't see a who's who of partisan Hollywood squares amusing our body politic to death. You'll see, I hope, in your eyes, an honest commitment to the last surviving civic education, or one of the last surviving civic educations on television. And it is, in fact, to me, an aspiration to be the Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers of civic education, in the absence of a commitment to those values. So that's one quote that I think frames the program. The other 2 quotes are from office holders. One, President Lincoln, and one senator, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Generations apart, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a UN ambassador. He was a United States Senator from New York, and all of you, I trust, know Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln said, "When new views become true views, I'll adopt them." When new views become true views, I'll adopt them. We don't live in a static age. We're learning through the scientific and journalistic processes, and therefore the data that define us, whether it's in the new media context or those values that are embedded in our conversations that preserve civic life and civilization. We are constantly shifting our definitions and seeing new realities as they unfold. In the same breath, I think we have to assert emphatically what Daniel Patrick Moynihan and many other politicians have been attributed to saying, which is you're entitled to your own opinions but not your own facts. And I think it's how we balance those two sentiments that's going to define the integrity of our media and our politics going forward. The idea that we need to be receptive to new conditions on the ground, but we can't exaggerate them, hyperbolize in an era where yellow journalism seems tame relative to conspiracy theories on InfoWars. It's our obligation as aspiring communicators in all of our fields, across disciplines, and certainly for those folks in the room who aspire to professions in media and journalism, to balance those realities, which is that we need to define a truth, and we also have to be vigilant in reporting on how our experience is evolving, or in the case of, I think, a lot of the politics today, devolving to our detriment. Those three quotes are ones that I emphasize because I think they enshrine what can be a collective commitment from voters in every state of the union and from politicians and from media outlets to underscore the common experience that we have, which is in order to live, in order to preserve the livelihood of our families and neighborhoods, we must preserve the integrity of facts, and we must be honest about what those facts are. And there could be no more important work, I think, than that undertaking. I emphasize what I find to be a deterioration in civil norms and decency and honor, and I don't view it as a cause and effect of President Trump, but I do think that the conditions of incivility have been exacerbated, and the last couple of weeks have testified to the further exacerbation of the incivility in the way that we treat our constituents, in the way that we report on facts or not on facts, and on innuendo and conspiracy. And I'm happy to answer specific questions later on the Supreme Court confirmation battle and the repercussions of that incivility. But suffice to say, I view the primary threat to both journalism and political or social capital that's going to sustain us as a nation, one nation, as being three incivilities. One is the incivility of bigotry. I think that if you have a bigoted mindset, then your brains are splattered on the floor because you're unable to reconcile differences, to rationalize, to reason, and to ultimately forge compromise, consensus, constructive decision-making that is really pivotal to any deliberative process. Media process, how an idea, an opinion become a story or an op-ed, or a political process like the act of legislation and the kinds of relationships that ought to be incentivized to develop mutual bonds and to restore faith in our ability to govern, from Oklahoma to New Jersey, from James Inhofe to Cory Booker, from Lindsey Graham to Amy Klobuchar. And these people aren't working together. They're working against a system, and they're working for, in more cases than not, a hyper-partisan environment that further incentivizes that embittered left-right entrenchment. So the idea of bigotry is not just a racial bigotry or religious bigotry or the kind of bigotry professed by this president in implementing a ban on travel to certain Muslim-majority countries in which he does not own properties. And that was a noticeable gap in the understanding. And I'm pretty sensitive to that as a New Yorker because, as you may or may not know, the hijackers who attacked us on 9/11, they weren't from the countries that President Trump barred new immigrants or immigration. And so it's important, again, facts, context, evolution. If we were facing a new threat from the countries that he included in his Muslim ban that the Supreme Court upheld, then those would be new conditions on the ground that we ought to evaluate. And so we might consider if the ISIS element or the Al-Qaeda element was brewing in those particular countries. And certainly we want to vet all immigrants to this country to ensure that they are committed to the betterment of this union and not the destruction of this union. And that's a fair thing to assert. But I think of bigotry in this more expansive idea. You can be bigoted towards constituents in Colorado or New Jersey or Oklahoma. You can fail to even engage in a conversation with someone with whom you're attempting to, because he or she defines himself or herself as liberal or conservative or libertarian or whatever it may be. There is a growing bigotry across geography and the political divide. And it's not just the decades-old resentments and exploitation of those resentments through race and religion, although those are still very much active and have to be combated at every stage, I think. So if you start from the perspective of the incivility of bigotry, I think you get to an incivility of obstructionism, which is if those mindsets are not open sufficiently to actually engage, then you're in a state of obstruction. There's a kind of perpetual impasse, and you saw that with the Merrick Garland nomination. You saw that with President Trump's insistence on nominating someone who is clearly, verifiably, a partisan creature and not committed to a judicial temperament or a jurisprudence based in the law. Even if you're an originalist like Antonin Scalia, or you're an Amy Coney Barrett, a self-defined conservative jurist, former professor, Notre Dame Law, we see here commitment to not upholding the law, but nominating someone who is not steeped in the values of clearly from the last 2 weeks, I think, have demonstrated of equal protection under the law and equal protection of Democrats, of Republicans, of independents, of conservatives, of liberals, and everyone in between. I sense in the air there's a lot of interest in this subject, so I want to take your questions about this, but it's my proposition that as someone who's committed not just as a journalist but as a citizen to the betterment of this country, that it's about upholding the integrity of the court. And that means that this nominee ought to be withdrawn and someone should be nominated, whether they're conservative or liberal or somewhere in between. Ideally, it would be someone who has established a track record that Republicans and Democrats both can appreciate, is committed to principles of justice and precedence and thoughtfulness and receptiveness to people, irrespective of party. But it's my proposition that we would be a whole lot better off with someone who does not impugn the integrity of the court. We can talk more about accusations and reality and how journalists have failed or upheld their responsibility during this last 2 weeks. Lastly, we get to an incivility of dysfunction. And that was illuminated in very clear detail these past weeks. It was illuminated in the dysfunction that prevented President Obama from even getting a hearing for his Supreme Court nominee. There was no advice, and there was certainly no consent. And the process was bigoted, obstructed, and ultimately dysfunctional. You could have long, deep debates about whether Supreme Court nominees should be appointed in election years. We're in one now, and you see the party that was committed to obstructing a jurist who was considered moderate on both sides of the political fence well, what happened to him and what happens now with a jurist who's not viewed as listening to both sides, and they're going to jam him through. That, to me, speaks volumes about this vicious cycle of incivility in the way that our government has operated. So I see those as being chickens and eggs. I don't think you can say the original cause of incivility in our discourse is bigotry or obstructionism or dysfunction. But that's really what I think most acutely captures our republic or our union right now. Not at the local level or state level necessarily, but at the federal level certainly. On the program that I host, we invite folks to think about prescriptions and to be constructive in their attitudes about media, about politics, diplomacy, science, technology, and it really does focus at this intersection of democracy and civil society. So before I invite you to ask me questions, of which I hope there are many, I wanted to spell out a few ideas to be constructive. How do we combat this incivility systematically, destroying our ability to facilitate conversations on college campuses, and certainly imposing huge gridlocks on what should be a democratic process that yields something at the end of the day, and that you give a little, I give a little, and we get to advancing our freedoms, our democracy, our economy, our justice system, whatever lens you might be viewing it through. So I've had a little experience attacking this and thinking about it both from the micro and the macro. So I think you all, as post-millennials, having reported and being an old fogey millennial, you are in this brave new age where, you know, there is no Encyclopedia Britannica being printed, and literacy could not be more important as a foundation to preserve civility. I think of civility as not just manners, but civilization. And if we don't have an informed populace, if we don't have an informed next generation, then we're going to be torn up by ourselves or by demagogues that want to tear us up. And so something as micro, specific as learning to be discerning navigators of the internet is really, you know, often something that's emphasized on my show and that I focus on. A librarian in the advent of Google, when it was just really becoming popular as a search engine, many years ago suggested, in fact demanded, that if you're going to search Google, you follow a search item with cite, S-I-T-E, :.edu. So you're discriminating against non-educational websites. So if we believe our educational institutions are not some conspiracy to indoctrinate, but actually present values that ought to be preserved in learning the facts encyclopedically, but learning critical thinking, then we ought to rely heavily on educational websites, organizational websites, right, .orgs, and not so much .coms. This is not to say that you can't read the New York Times or ProPublica. ProPublica is a nonprofit, and today websites don't really have the impact if they don't have some version of .com. But many .coms are not .orgs or .edus, certainly. And it's important to understand the incentives of both old and new media and whether they are fueled just by you liking and favoriting and clicking, what we've come to know as clickbait, or if they're fueled by an independent commitment to fact-finding, the preservation of real knowledge. One website like that, 20 years ago, we could not have conceived of, because Encyclopedia Britannica was still being printed, as Wikipedia. It became, and it is today, the largest and most reliable source of verifiable information from years and years ago when it was viewed by professors and lay people alike to be dubious, questionable. It shows you what a team of not just experts, but citizens, in the case of Wikipedia, can be committed to if they have a support system of users who view themselves as not just clickbait, but folks who want to be genuinely informed and engage in fact-finding and becoming more knowledgeable. So similarly, I think at a micro level, newspapers, the chair and I were talking about this, should be limiting the influence of comment sections that veer towards the incivility. Some newspapers, some media outlets have understood that if the attention is going to spotlight the investigation or the story or the op-ed or the episode of the Open Mind, whatever it may be, that's where the attention deserves to be. And if you're going to facilitate a question or comment section, it ought to be done within the parameters of how is this furthering our understanding of what was just reported. And that's not how comment sections have worked for years. And as we all know, Facebook, Twitter, and the like built a whole culture or counterculture to really thrust upon us the incentives of the comment section, which are irrelevance, ad hominem personal attacks in the cloak of anonymity. And that's how it worked for many years. Now some sites are saying, well, if we're going to have a comment section, we want to make sure our readers actually know what this story is about. So quiz you and say, what, 3 questions, basic questions that you could learn reading 300 words or 200 words in. If you're genuinely committed, again, that word genuine. That's an authentic news experience. The comment section is not an authentic news experience. It is just more of that, to paraphrase Neil Postman, amusing our democracy to death, amusing our journalism culture to death. And if there is one Bible that predicted Donald Trump, it is that book by Neil Postman, the New York University media critic, who appeared on The Open Mind with my grandfather many times. He wrote the book of how Trump would lead us from The Apprentice and would project that the boardroom of that reality show was a simulation of the White House Situation Room, right? Neil Postman said, the American people, if you are going to dumb us down from Thomas Paine common sense to tweets without any context, any guarantee of knowledge or fact, or any basis in reality, which often is the case of Twitter, which can be unverified even if a verified account is posting the information, that's where we are. And so these kinds of micro citizen responsibility initiatives with your own search habits, browser is another one. What browser you're using. If you're using Mozilla Firefox, that's a nonprofit. They're not going to sell your data and to unknown third parties. If you use Chrome or Safari, Google or Apple, those are the 2 proprietors of those browsers, it's much more likely that your data will be compromised. And many of us don't read the fine print when we buy products on Amazon. So we're all in this brave new world, and literacy is something that can be achieved through small steps that we all take independently and then collectively to have a more literate politics and economy and culture. So on the micro level, I just described a few suggestions to be constructive. On the macro piece of this intensely partisan moment in our history, which is not different. There have been stages of incivility. There was the disunion of this country. So I'm not suggesting to you by any measure that incivility is a new problem. It's a problem for every society at one juncture or another, and sometimes it speeds up and becomes a more serious problem. You're dealing with the following now at a macro level, which is toxic rhetoric emanating from the White House after decades of diatribes on cable news, and that Twitter culture that feeds into the bloodstream of our information intake, the tweet, whether it's true or false, whether there's context or no context. And so that becomes the software, the operating software of our consciousness as human beings. That is where we are today, like it or not. So what do you do at a macro level? At a macro level, I was a fellow at New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce University during the 2016 primary campaign. And New Hampshire PBS invited myself and the chair of the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communications, named after the only two president, 3 terms, not full terms, press secretary Marlin Fitzwater for Reagan and H.W. Bush. And that center is committed to promoting and educating leaders of and communicators of conscience in media, which is, I know, something that your leaders are committed to too. And so New Hampshire PBS invited us to have what we were going to call primary dialogue. As you may know, the first in the nation contest is a caucus in Iowa during the presidential cycle. After the Iowa caucus comes the New Hampshire primary. And so it was our intent during the 2016 campaign to have a roundtable, you might call it Socratic or Harkness, whatever your favorite term is, and to invite Republicans and Democrats alike. I had recently hosted Senator Sanders on the show, and we were getting positive feedback from Governor Bush. And we got some folks receptive to our idea. And then SLAM, the folks who agreed to, in principle, join us, got letters from the convention, the RNC and DNC, and said if you participate in this, if it wasn't formal letters, it was a whiff of what was relayed to us. And it was, if you participate in anything other than our sanctioned events, the Democratic National Committee sponsored debates or RNC sponsored debates, we will bar you from going to the popular debates, the ones you want to be at. And so what do we remember the 2016 New Hampshire primary for? Well, I can name one thing and one thing alone, despite the fact that New Hampshire PBS, the Live Free or Die Alliance, the largest nonprofit civic education group in the state, we at Franklin Pierce all developed this plan, which was get these candidates around a table, talk about 3 issues of imperativeness to New Hampshire voters. So what do we remember for? Not a huge pipeline dispute that has been ongoing in New England and New Hampshire specifically, or gun safety, which is a really important issue in the backdrop, as I know it is here too, of Sandy Hook. The other piece of the pipeline issue is environmental stewardship versus efficiency and cost of energy. Another really important issue that I know you grapple with here in snowy country. That's going to be an important issue. We remember it for Marco Rubio being decimated by his repetition. He sounded like a robot. He repeated something 3-4 times. Chris Christie confronted him in a way that made him uncomfortable, and that was a single moment in the debate, and that was what we remembered for. It was a debate that made Christie more relevant to New Hampshire voters and altered the trajectory of the primary so that there was a further split in the field, and Rubio sinking in losing a base of support, widening the field to Kasich, then made it so that Donald Trump could win the Republican nomination, not having won a majority of Republican votes in all of the early states, or most of the early states. Instead, the consequence of all of these other candidates, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, splitting the vote. And so not only did you really lack a serious forum for issues of importance to New Hampshire voters, the personalities and the confrontation of Marco Rubio in that debate led to a whole trajectory, and the eventual outcome being Donald Trump as the Republican nominee. I think that the idea of a primary dialogue or a conversation with candidates is something that has been repeated with limited success. But one example is the very charismatic and unifying candidate in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, who traveled with his neighboring congressperson, Will Hurd, on Facebook Live and drove from their districts to Washington, D.C. And Beto O'Rourke has become an attractive candidate to young people for his humility, for his authenticity, for his articulateness, but for his courage to say, we're not just going to compete in the discourse of D versus R, but we're going to engage our neighbor, in his case, Will Hurd, Republican of the next door district. And so that's an example of why you're hearing more and more about Beto O'Rourke and why he would be an inspiring and I think highly successful and credible candidate, not just for the Senate in Texas, even if he were to lose against Ted Cruz, but going forward as a presidential candidate perhaps. So I hope that I've laid a bit of groundwork here for you to conceive of and maybe ask me questions about what are the solutions here if we think of the problems associated with the news and politics culture today. We haven't talked at all about bots and trolls and the animation of misinformation or disinformation, the magnification of that misinformation or disinformation on social platforms that have only emboldened those seeking to divide us, whether that is Russian operatives or anyone. Small steps, measured steps have been taking place at Facebook, so at least we know in an ad archive who's running what ads. So you can see the Beto O'Rourke campaign's ads in the Facebook ad archive as of just a couple months ago, or the Ted Cruz ads. But what we continue to lack, and with this I'll close, is a transparent culture that brings up to date the civil norms and discourse and transparency that we ought to expect from our television commercials just as much on Twitter or Facebook. So there is pending legislation, the Honest Ads Act, that would require disseminated videos that are streamed of campaign advertisements to list and read at the beginning and the end, just like any TV ad you might see in your governor's race this year, paid for by. There is nothing like that today because the FCC has been dormant, and the new innovations of the age have not been brought up to the standard of just kind of a bottom level, a common denominator of transparency and honesty that the FCC was really designed to foster from the beginning. So we're a long way from the time when you could actually have a single TV station and provide equity, and one candidate gets a half hour, another candidate gets a half an hour. That ship has sailed. But the idea that we would allow ourselves to be misinformed or disinformed, for those who are really seeking to malevolently alter our understanding for their own power, whether that's a president or a dark money group, we all have to take collective responsibility today to ensure that measures like the Honest Ads Act and other efforts to provide a base level foundation of equity, accountability, and transparency, that is what I advocate so strongly. And to go back to the very beginning, it's because I am a partisan for truth and a partisan for civil norms that are, I think, fundamental to restoring civil discourse in what is apparently, ostensibly, to everybody in this room, an uncivil age that we're living in. So thank you for your time. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Alexander, for
Thank
your
you.
conversation with us. And so we do have some time for questions. I'm looking for the microphone. That's what I was.
I have it back
looking
here.
around Okay, good. So we do have a microphone that we can offer for people who would like to ask questions. I wanted to see if I could
Yes.
ask you first, just to elaborate on the comment that you made about journalism and how you felt that it has either upheld or failed to uphold its mission over the last couple of weeks.
Well, I think that it's upheld its responsibility to ensure that we report on the process, report on exactly what's going on. The process stories are actually maybe the most important. It's how Senator Coons of Delaware reacted to a journalist saying that Jeff Flake, Senator Flake of Arizona, was going to vote yes, and Senator Coons let an expletive fly out of frustration, and I think broke down. Was visibly upset. And there are a few reporters who really saw the body language as it was playing out in the committee and now have told us that whole story, which I think in some ways culminated last night on 60 Minutes with the Flake-Coons interview. So from that perspective, there were some really great journalists who were doing the TikTok process story of, what this is like. So I don't think that our media have let us down over the last couple of weeks. I think they've presented the allegations, the accusations. They've described what is standing in the way of this confirmation, and they're focused on the question of perjury. I think it's really the politicians who have not been so civil. I think the media have operated in an environment where they were respectful of the process and the accused and the accuser, and I think from that perspective I couldn't really be critical of the journalistic cohort. I think that there aren't enough people in the media and in politics in general emphasizing the point about the integrity of the court. So I don't think that's critical of the media. It may be more critical of the politicians, but it's been pointed out that Justice, your own Justice Gorsuch, flew through this process without accusations, without the question of impropriety. I think since he has become a justice, he has done a couple of events at the Trump Hotel in D.C. and keynoting there, and that may have raised some red flags. But during the actual process of vetting, there was no accusation leveled against him. So I think people are missing the point a little bit. It's not that Dr. Ford is, unquestionably correct in her recollection, or he's unquestionably correct in his recollection. It's that this is the highest court of the land. And there are people who are going to come forward, men and women, who aren't going to carry with them baggage, whether that's heavy drinking or sexual assault, or someone mocked up Merrick Garland's high school yearbook next to Brett Kavanaugh's high school yearbook. The question of character, to me, is an important one. It's a criteria for anyone I invite on the show, whether that's Bill Frist or Mitch Daniels, conservatives, or liberals, Bill Bradley, Senator Sanders, people who I think are engaging in a kind of respectful discourse. And the combination of the yearbook and the combination of the way he responded to the accusation in front of the U.S. Senate was pretty clear that he was not being civil, you know. So I think that it's the politicians, not really the media, who need to reiterate that there are conservatives and liberals who are going to be appointed for positions and are not going to face 1, 2, or 3 accusations. It's also been pointed out that Gorsuch's nomination and confirmation came before the height of the Me Too scandal. I mean, I think that if you're going to provide a full context, you need to say that, and that there might be a greater impediment to successful nominees who have engaged in any questionable behavior, but then put someone up who hasn't engaged in any questionable behavior. There are such people. So that's, and so to the extent that I'm critical of the media, it's because they refuse to say that too, which is important. But the politicians need to say it, and they need to say it in a nonpartisan way. And of course, no Republican was willing to own up to that. And since when has conservatism only been about abortion? I thought conservatism was about character. You can connect abortion and character if you want, and you know, reproductive health questions are connected to your character and disposition as a candidate or elected office holder. So it's fine to make the correlation between public policy and your sort of fundamental decency, honor, and character. But this is not about his view on abortion. This is about his character, his expressions, his contact with the outside world. And if you know, from the point of view of someone who thinks that it's not legitimate to question or challenge high school, or college, I don't know, when does it stop? When does your character no longer matter? To me, high school and college are fair game.
I have a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
too, because actually one of the things that I do on my free time, I'm kind of a sucker for coming-of-age television and films. And so I'm wondering how many of you, at any age, have watched 13 Reasons Why? Raise your hand if you've watched 13 Reasons Why. So some of you have seen that before. How many of you watched the hearings that happened on Thursday, the Supreme Court hearings? So what did you say, that's about the same number? So how many of you kind of felt like you were watching Bryce Walker on the stand? Is anybody, that's from 13 Reasons Why, if you had seen that. I mean, I definitely felt like there was sort of a connection there. And I'm wondering, the reason I raise that is because I feel like a lot of times our popular culture is able to express things in a way that is very resonant with where we are politically. And I think 13 Reasons Why is an example of this. I'm not sure if any of you even like that program, but it seems to me like there is a certain resonance between what we're seeing in 13, or what you probably saw over the summer in 13 Reasons Why, and how that has then played out in relation to the new Me Too movement that maybe those of us who are a little bit older are also more familiar with. But I guess I'm wondering if some of you are able to make some connections between some of the things that are unfolding and the way that civil discourse happens in a variety of settings, in politics as well as in other places. So I'm wondering if any of you have any examples that you'd like to ask about, or things that you would like to share as comments as you think about what does it mean to be civil or uncivil today as a college student. We can wait. What does it mean to be uncivil or civil in a college class or on a college campus? Do you experience any of this anywhere? Maybe you just see it in fiction. Any other places, in news? Any concerns you have? First one in the front row.
I'm not a college student, but I would just like to point out something. I was in California recently, and my daughter went to back to school night, and one of my granddaughter's teachers was new at that school, and the parents came in, and she said, I just want to thank all of you, because this is the first time, and this teacher had taught for over 10 years. I just want to thank all of you for teaching your children to say thank you. And it just seems, I mean, even at that level, that kind of respect has to be taught then. And then if you go to the hearing, and you saw Senator Klobuchar had a question for Judge Kavanaugh. That question about his drinking, whether that was appropriate or not, or whether you agree, we try not to get into family things here, but I think his answer was totally uncivil, but he did, when he came back after recess, he put it together again. But
Right. And he didn't apologize to Senator Whitehouse, who he also was asking if he likes beer. I mean, the idea that you could so turn upside down a hearing. I mean, there are people accused of ethical impropriety or legal impropriety, and I mean, you know, the ones who do that in court are the ones who are, you know, they're not going to get a good defense, and now they're not going to stand up for themselves. You know, there are Law and Order episodes where the defendants, and it's not, you know, for those of you who are saying it's not a trial, it wasn't a trial, but what if you're in a committee hearing, in a faculty disagreement, and you started asking the questions like that, you'd probably be fired on the spot. You start asking the chair or the dean, you know, did you do that? I mean, it's just in some level inane, but I so appreciate what you said about common decency and manners, and that's not to be lost in the civility discussion, because I remember when I was struggling to find new housing because my Craigslist, after one time using Craigslist, it was successful. Then the next time, it wasn't so successful. All kinds of construction going on. I couldn't breathe in where I was living. So I had to find a new place to live fast. And I was introduced to a gentleman who's an ambassador who had an open basement in his townhouse or his apartment. And you know, he had no intention of leasing it. It was not kept up or maintained or prepared for someone to use it. And I always remember that he said that he granted the request after interviewing me to live there because I said, sir. I mean, and I said it several times over the course of a conversation, on the phone, and he was an ambassador too, so I said ambassador too, but he made that reference. He said people don't say that anymore. You know, people don't acknowledge that kind of way of speaking. So I really relate to what you're saying. But I'm also happy to answer any questions on anything related to media, anything related to politics. Who's the most competitive candidate in 2020 against President Trump, or any thoughts about covering the primary from 2016 and how that might inform the process for primaries in 2020. Yes, sir.
What are Trump's prospects in your opinion in 2020? Like, what chances do you have of winning a second term? Just assuming he's
Could you repeat the question here?
Yeah, my question is pertaining to what you think of Trump's prospects in 2020, assuming he isn't impeached by the end of his first term.
Sure. Well, I think that what President Obama said about President Obama said a few different things about President Trump, and one of them was spot on, and that is don't underestimate him, especially in the way that he has appealed to both a uber wealthy demographic that benefits from the corporate tax reform and corporate tax cuts, and the working folks who saw Hillary Clinton and the New Democratic Party, what Thomas Frank, the cultural critic, calls the innocrats, you know, combining inequity and Democrat, folks who have an alliance with Silicon Valley and in the eyes of West Virginia and Wisconsin and Michigan have abandoned the working class. So that in and of itself presents a difficult conundrum for the opposition party because while Trump's allegiance or his loyal, you know, cult following is 30 to 40% I'd say it hovers probably closer to 30%. There are people who would be immensely turned off by a Democratic candidate who defines himself or herself out of the historical identity of what this country is, and I'm talking about democratic socialism. Harry Truman fought communism and socialism. He was a Democrat. He was proud to be a Democrat. I was in Wyoming a couple weeks ago. Wyoming voted for Harry Truman. Bless you. Wyoming voted for Lyndon Johnson. And these voters were aware that these were folks in elected office who were intending to serve their constituents through government as a force for good, not just government as shrinking it to the least it can offer. And so it's so important in 2020 for the Democratic nominee, whoever that may be, whether it's Kamala Harris or Liz Warren, whoever it may be, to defend the honor of the Democratic Party as an institution with roots in helping people. And that does not equate to democratic socialism. And these ideas about free education, free healthcare, it doesn't work in a system that we have that is, I said before, the operating software is the tweet. Well, the bleeding heart of the country is capitalism. And so whether it's Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, whoever runs on a not a phony populism, but a kind of democratic populism or a new democratic populism, I think has to speak in the language that universal health care, Medicare for all, whatever you want to call it, that's an idea from Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman and FDR, had he been able to enact something like that. And none of those people call themselves democratic socialists. Now, has capitalism wrought a dog-eat-dog, cannibalistic, and crony economic climate of haves and have-nots and folks who are just really the ones benefiting from the recent tax legislation and everybody else who's not benefiting from it, especially in California, New York, and some. Yeah, so I think it's really important, not so much about the viability of the candidate himself or herself, because I think there are a number of potential Democratic candidates who have the requisite charisma to challenge Trump successfully. It's about how you're framing the discourse. And what President Obama said that I thought was off, well, two things, I mentioned three things. One was this idea that he gave a speech, it was his first speech since coming back onto the campaign trail, and he said, I disagree with some of my Democratic friends that, who think we need to fight fire with fire. And then he went on to define fighting fire with fire as lying to your voters or lying to the American people. Fighting fire with fire is not lying. And it was a remarkable transition that he went from, I disagree with some of my Democratic friends. It's not about the Democrats having to compete with lies. It's about the bombast. It's about the vigor, the gusto, the bravado, the inner core, speaking with confidence. And that's fighting fire with fire. It's not lying to voters or lying to the American people. It's being in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt said, and being in the contemporary arena where you have to fire with the same velocity. But if you're the Democrat running against what you view as a Trump who tweets falsehoods and whines and complains, then you take the tone, like an Amy Klobuchar tone, and you bring to it gusto and passion, but you're honest and you're truthful and you provide the context to the American people that's needed. And the other thing that Obama did was he took credit for the Trump economy, or attempted to take credit for the recent continued economic successes of these last years. Well, those successes aren't felt in wage increases for 99% of the American people, or health care, or the livelihood of folks, whether they're in Colorado or New York or California or Wyoming or anywhere. And so, to me, that was such a false idea. And if the Democrat accepts that the Trump economy has helped people like those working folks that I alluded to in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida that decided the election, then that's going to be a failure too. Because outside of that 30% of cult tribal allegiance to Donald Trump, there is going to be a continued reality that, well, we elected this person, but he's not actually improving the livelihoods, of the vast majority of Americans. So from that perspective, I think that Donald Trump, the prospects right now, because the Democrats have not coalesced around a kind of cohesive framing and strategy, is the flip of a coin, but more likely than not that he might be reelected. Yes.
Hi. Number one, I want to thank you and your grandfather for your programming.
Thank you.
I was able to use a clip from The Open Mind from 1951 in a documentary that I did, so thank you for that. My question today is about the erosion of democracy, and particularly what the Russians are doing in terms of not only Facebook ads, but I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on a story that I think is missing right now from journalism, and that is the extent to which voting rights are being questioned, and the extent to which the Russians might be behind actually changing votes in a system that seems fairly unprotected from outside interference.
Thank you, and thanks for your comment. Are you at all asking this in the backdrop of the Kathleen Hall Jamieson story and book, which is one on the Russia scandal that is recently released? I believe that it's still the intelligence community's understanding that vote tallies were not disrupted or distorted, the actual numbers of votes, because there aren't any forensic studies that I've seen that could corroborate that, that in those states, or as I actually asked on the show, I had a former CIA operative, the creator of the show The Americans, so I hosted him, and this was several months before the election. I asked him a question which I think some folks might have thought was way out of left field several months before the election, and that was, was it possible that the illegals, those are the secret Soviet spies, that's what they called them then, were in the clothing of Americans and actually working in boards of election in this country, and he thought not. And I think that we have to challenge his pretty emphatic statement then, because it's possible that there were operatives not just working in the way we know on Facebook and Twitter to, say Hillary Clinton is Satan or Donald Trump, We don't know the answer to your question in terms of the full impact. But what we do know is that these candidates were perceived as, by the American people, to be really not just diametrically opposed ideologically, but the way that the disinformation materialized, they were programming on both sides to create this narrative about both candidates. And so what has been documented is that whether it was Russia or former Soviet states in which these troll farms were operating, they were amplifying the negativity and the assault on Secretary Clinton in particular, but also at times on then candidate Trump. So I can't speak to it any more expertly than what has been reported in the mainstream. but I think that I've had a few people on the show, including Nick Monaco from Jigsaw, which is Google's think tank, who's commented on the influence of bots and trolls. And of course, we know bots and trolls, right? So we know, bots are just, during the course of the 2016 campaign, automation, that is multiplying the effect of what we consider trolls. There could be online trolls or not online trolls, but they have the same effect of harassing and inciting violence. And so I think all of that continues pretty steadily on Twitter. On Facebook, they've tried to take some measures in recent weeks and months to limit the extent of new groups and to pull groups. I would say Facebook has tackled both the bot and troll problem, not completely by any measure, but more seriously than Twitter, which I think has addressed more the bot problem than the troll problem, because accounts continue to roam free and even sometimes are magnified and go viral that are engaging in political violence, inciting political violence, or hate speech. You also asked about voting rights. I think, from my perspective, that's the issue. Not people think about the social issues that the Supreme Court will weigh in on and how that's going to affect our lives going forward. But the idea from this most recent Supreme Court term of cases decided that you could really have your citizens stripped away and your name and identity purged from the records in Ohio, this is where the case was, because you don't respond to a postcard that the government may or may not send you, was truly highlighting the threat that continues. Voting rights are under real assault, and you often think about voting rights through a historical lens of those who've been denied the right, women, African Americans, and the state measures that prevented full enfranchisement. Now we're talking about an even broader degree of disenfranchisement in that Supreme Court case, which ruled in favor of Ohio, which it said was within its constitutional prerogative to purge people if they didn't vote. It's long been said in this country that you have a right to vote or not to vote, and both as a journalist and a citizen, I implore voting to satisfy your interests, your family's interests, your community's interests, society's interests. But that case in Ohio and the way the court ruled on it forebodes something rather ugly in our future. Yes.
What can communicators like yourself do, or should you do, to increase the abysmal voter turnout rate in this country?
So one idea, first I'm heartened to see that there is in Texas with Beto O'Rourke and in Florida with Andrew Gillum what seems to be a surge, if not a resurgence, of young people's interest this cycle, which is unusual because young people, like you, I think you used the word dismal, but that's the word I usually use, right? Dismal, awful, voter turnout during the midterm cycles. So young people are poised to do something they've never done. That is the 18 to 30-year-old demographic, if you want to include millennials and post-millennials, and that is to not just beat expectations, which is well under 10% of the share of millennials who are going to vote in a midterm cycle, but really make a powerful statement. And I think that you saw through activism in the wake of the Parkland massacre, the emergence of political leaders from this post-millennial generation who are taking a different approach than the millennial generation, which is a redefinition of activism, not as just clicktivism, on digital, virtual engagement, but being reminded of the potence of boots on the ground, town hall meetings, letters to the editor, campaigns in the case of Florida to end gun violence. So I'm more hopeful than not about the young people's participation because of both the climate in general that I've been exposed to and seeing elements that I saw as a really young reporter in 2008 as a student myself covering that campaign, which is President Obama and then candidate Obama's galvanizing effect on this generation that for political and cultural reasons, I think in particular, less policy reasons, that we could elect someone that breaks a glass ceiling and is perceived as a triumph over racial disharmony, inequality, which was a big prevalent sentiment in the election of President Obama. His leadership, his 2004 keynote address at the DNC in Boston. Unfortunately, much of that was unrealized in terms of the unification of this country and the idea that red states and blue states could respect each other. But to answer your question, I think a lot of communicators' responsibility is framing, and one example is that red state, blue state, which is not just like a warfare of constant divisiveness that ought to stimulate for communicators. But the idea that we ought to respect localities, San Francisco may not want to govern the same way as Tulsa, and Tulsa may not want to govern the same way as Miami, we have to respect that. And yet also preserve national, federal constitutional norms. But I think we've absolutely lost the respect for the idea that we ought to govern according to the most fact-based, intellectually rigorous assessment of what's going to give people livelihood, good jobs, healthcare, according to where they live. And so I think a communicator's responsibility is to recognize that folks in Cory Booker's New Jersey and James Inhofe's Oklahoma are gonna, they're gonna want to govern maybe a little bit differently, and that's respectable. And every so often, Booker should go spend some time with Inhofe's constituents, and Inhofe should go spend some time with Booker's constituents. Yes.
How do you perceive the role of dark money in contributing or promoting divisiveness?
I think the anonymity, it's almost a perfect storm of anonymity, because you have the anonymity that is so prevalent in these online forums that govern a lot of our attention, and then you have the anonymity that is likewise so prevalent in the way that, deceptively named super PACs are advertising. So I think it's hugely impactful. And I myself, I think, would encourage folks to think about campaign systems that are going to be more equitable. And I think the strongest argument in favor of unlimited money in our politics is an economic argument, that you're actually stimulating the economy. Otherwise, what are you accomplishing? I mean, if you're just trying to kind of add to the robustness of capitalism, well, there are a lot of other ways to do that. If you're interested in funding campaigns, people are going to raise money, they're going to do events, it's going to require some money upstart. I think, to me, a fair electoral system would be that you win on the merit of your message, and so there's a cap. That you, whatever that cap may be, just like there aren't 20 debates by the Commission on Presidential Debates, and just like there aren't multiple caucuses and multiple primaries in one state. There's an extent to which the process can avoid the influence of just those who can control through monetary means. Of course, lobbying is going to occur in our government because there are people who have interests and want to express those interests, whether they're school teachers, railway employees, or whatever career you may have, whether you're represented by a union or not. Lobbying is always going to occur, but right now it's not the workers or the representatives of those lobbying organizations that have the power. It's just the leadership of those organizations, and frankly, their super PACs, and who controls the message in any dark money super PAC it has no basis in what actually the people who are represented in that organization want to see. It's specific to the dollars and the family or the individual doing that. So I would like to see this next generation take a leadership in campaign finance that is going to be equitable, which would be much more in line with most other developed democracies. Yes.
Thanks for being here today.
Yes.
I got the impression that the last couple of candidates that have been elected president, as much a part of it is based on anger and reacting to a person in office before, such as what had happened during the Bush years, and that was part of Obama being elected, and also the same thing with Trump being elected too, as far as an angry constituency. But I get the impression that it's been more so with these two elections than maybe sometimes in the past. And I have another quick question outside, and I don't know if it's time here or afterwards.
Please, go
about
ahead.
some other impressions about the hearing.
Okay, maybe
today.
after. I think the exploitation of anger was a feature on full display, and the animus was on full display. And I mean, Donald Trump gained credibility with the conservative press with the smear of birtherism. There's just no doubt about it. He became a factor as a function of that smear campaign. Now, you could say that President Obama, when he was a state senator, calling the Iraq War stupid, he was, again, interrogating the idea, not the person, right? So there's a clear definitive difference in the way one man governed and the other man governed, or one man campaigned and the other man campaigned. And I couldn't emphasize that. Yes, pendulums swing, but what we're witnessing now in the way that Donald Trump presents himself more than not is not a swing from liberal to conservative. It's a swing from republicanism to oligarchic or autocratic authoritarian impulses. I mean, you can't call the country we live in anything other than a constitutionally protected republic. There are plenty of people who criticize the president, and they are not lit up, tarred and feathered. And so you can, in this country, safely criticize the president if you're not a member of the Republican Party. There were plenty of Democrats who were critical of President Obama. And so that's a difference, another difference in the dynamics at play here, which is the Republicans who were running for re-election, with the exception of only the ones sort of retiring, are not challenging threats to basic order. So the pendulum swings. Whether Donald Trump's kind of imperiousness or would-be authoritarianism, it translates into actual damage to our everyday norms. Right now, it most manifests in my profession when, you can't just say he's joking when he calls the press the enemy of the people, or the fake news, or whatever classification he's making. I mean, he has tweeted multiple times, generically, so generally, the media are the enemy of the people, the press is the enemy of the people. And so when you see events of increased threats or violence against journalists, then there can be some direct correlations made with that mindset, that attitude, and the way that our country is going to respond to the increasing criminalization of folks who want to hold this administration accountable. And so that's a very real threat. But again, to me, it's it's would-be authoritarianism, and again, just to emphasize, you can't compare the expressions of anger of President Obama and President Trump. Two different universes.
Excuse me, I hope I was clear about my question in terms of, Obama was a lot elected because of the anger about what
Yeah.
happened in Bush years.
Sure.
And then he took care of business. And
Anger is, yeah, no, I didn't mean to misconstrue. Anger is a real provocative and helpful stimulus for sort of electoral hand-to-hand combat, you know? Yeah.
I saw a question back here.
Thank you. One thing you said that really stuck with me is that you are a partisan for truth.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, historically, if that has ever been the popular mindset for our political system, and if so, when did that change?
It's a great question. There's a book that attempts to answer this called The Last Great Senate. It attempts to answer it by anecdotes of politicians working together, seeing the truth as it is, like crumbling infrastructure. And to the gentleman's question behind you about 2020, I think that's another area where Donald Trump is vulnerable, because America's going to look around in next year and in the election year and see that was a fraud, because there has been no renewed effort or initiative in our airports and our school buildings, as far as I can tell, are not underway with some great, replenishment of and revitalization. And I would think that a smart candidate, whether it's a primary challenger to Trump or a general election candidate, would go and do press conferences at all these crumbling infrastructure sites and say that was a fraud. That was fraudulent. You put your name up on a lot of buildings. You didn't build those buildings. You said we were living in a third world country. Well, now it's your third world America. So, to me, being a partisan for the truth is also recognizing when one party or one president is lying. And there have been times when there was a consensus that a certain president or a certain elected official was behaving in a way inconsistent with those values. But that book by Ira Shapiro talks about the specific challenges that our country faced, whether it was recession or military intervention, and how presidents and specifically senators found common ground and worked and achieved legislative success. They're senators, some of whom have been honored by the Profile and Courage Award. It's not just for senators, but the Kennedy Award. He wrote a book talking about profiles in courage. So you see a lot of profiles in cowardice today in our politics, and we just have to keep repeating that. There was a time, while maybe morality has shifted, there was a time when we honored that sanctity, that the moral virtue and imperative of bipartisanship and cooperation and statesmanship. And I don't want to say there was one person who accomplished that, but certainly people in this book that you could look up that weren't in Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, because that dates back all the way close to the founding, I think. But more recent examples can be found in Shapiro's book. Howard Baker, Bob Dole, Ted Kennedy. There are a whole host of people whose stories are told in that book. I would refer you to that.
Right. Well, I think we're just about running out of time, and so if you have some extra questions, I did see some extra hands around, and Alexander will be here for a little while.
And happy to answer more questions. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. In the book that is over there is kind of looking at American history through what's happened in the last 10 years. So you've probably read Howard Zinn or Alan Brinkley or David Kennedy, but the book that I co-authored, that I just added a new chapter to, is really thinking about all these challenges to our democracy today, and there really aren't that many resources when it comes to anthologies that try to account for what the heck has gone on in the last decade. So that's what I'm happy to talk to you about that later.
And so now we get to present Alexander with the award. So if I could bring up the Estlow daughters, please come up, Nancy and Susan. So Alexander Heffner has been awarded with the honor of being the Estlow Anvil Freedom Award recipient this year. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Congratulations. It's a great paperweight.
Yes, it's a great paperweight. Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Well, if you have more questions, I'm going to be over there.
Yeah, so he's going to be over in the back, and please help yourself to some more snacks before you go. Thanks so much for being here this afternoon. All right, so you better go back to
Okay, cool.
where that is. Great job.
Good.